One of the reasons I decided that this would be a fun thing to do, number one being a historian, I'm always interested in the history of things, but like, I don't know how many of us here are cradle Episcopalians. I know Joe is, but, and Bill, you're a cradle? Margaret, are you cradle? No, you're not, and I know Linda's not, and I'm not, and Miss Olivia is Catholic, Roman Catholic, and Scott is just Scott. So, anyway, and I'm always interested in the history of things to come. Hold on 1 second here. And I also had to realize, as Scott tells me, Sam, not everybody's interest in history is your interest in history, so don't make it boring. But we start out one Holy Catholic and Apostolic, and we are one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and our catechism tells us, it comes from our catechism, and it says, so I'm just going to read this, how is the Church described in the creeds? The Church described as one Holy Catholic and Apostolic. Why is the Church described as one? The Church is one because it's in one body, under one head, our Lord Jesus Christ. Why is the Church described as holy? The Church is holy because the Holy Spirit dwells in it, consecrates its members, and guides them to do God's work. Why is the Church described as Catholic? The Church is Catholic because it proclaims the whole faith to all people to the end of time. Why is the Church described as Apostolic? The Church is Apostolic because it continues in the teaching and fellowship of the Apostles and is sent to carry out Christ's mission to all people. Apostolic is also, has been described, and the best way I heard it described was it was one big game of tag. And because our bishop, Jake Olmsby, who by the way his name is spelled wrong on the photo there, if you look at his lines, he traces his lines all the way back to Paul. I mean, you can trace who consecrated who and who consecrated who in all way. So it's kind of like that one big game of tag, and that is really a good way of telling it. But this series is going to be a couple segments, because in order to understand the American Episcopal Church, which we are part of, you've got to understand the English Church and how it got its start. And some people don't. We think of the English Church as being started of Henry VIII because he divorced his wife. That is not really true. We think of the Reformation as being started by Martin Luther at the 95 Theses, and that is not true. There were people before him, there were things going on with him. So that's something, so I want to cover the English Church tonight, and then next week we'll deal with the American Episcopal Church. In order to do that, we've got to start with the Reformation. And you can see this is the tacking of the 95 Theses onto the church door. That's famous Martin Luther. And many people believe that Martin Luther was, is that our phone? Mm-hmm. Of all times. Okay.
It does that.
It does that, yes. I know. So,
oh, Lord.
Hi, Sherry. What you doing?
Oh, yeah.
Okie dokie. Okay. Bye-bye.
You got her number?
They're at Slagle. They will be here in about 15 minutes.
Okay, well, they'll come in the middle of it. There will be a test afterwards. Anyway, that'll get Randy. Anyway, Martin Luther was born in 1483. He died in 1546. He was actually known as Hans Luther, L-U-D-E-R, and it was translated to Luther later on. He's best known for his 95 Theses. He nailed to the church door on October 31st, 1517. I really believe there's a correlation why he chose All Hallows Eve for that. And the doctrine of, he mainly focused on the doctrine of indulgences, or buying your way into heaven, or dead person's way into heaven. He claimed that justification was on faith alone and not works. And believe it or not, Henry hated Lutheranism. He wrote a book called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which was an anti-Luther book. But our church, the American Episcopal Church, believe it or not, follows Luther's beliefs more than the English church does. It's really interesting when you look at it, and we'll deal with that later. But Luther was not the beginning of the Reformation. I would like to introduce you to the real beginning of the Reformation. And it's this little guy. Okay? Actually, it's the fleas on this little guy that kind of start the Reformation. And when you think about this, back in this era, there was one church. It was the Catholic Church. It was not known as Roman Catholic. It was Catholic because there was no Roman Catholic until after Henry's break. And the priests, the bishops, the deacons, the nuns were all seen kind of above the common people. They were also seen as being in league with God, and therefore God would never, ever do anything bad to them. Maybe one or two may be out of sync. But what started happening during the Black Plague is deacons, priests, bishops, and nuns started dying. So the people were looking like, well, if this is a curse from God, which they believed the Black Plague was, then we have some bad priests, nuns, deacons, and what's going on. The clergy were so afraid to even approach the people who were dying to give them last rites that the Pope himself gave a dispensation and allowed the lay people, including women, to hear confession when intimate death was there and to absolve in place of a priest. So it put the lay people in this area where they were thinking, what's going on here? Why are these priests and nuns dying? That's really what started to push the Reformation forward and started it. And it was because the people were finally seeing the clergy as they were just people. And so we went on. But when you look at that, we have a bunch of other people that come into play. John Wycliffe, who's the first person you see on the left, was actually born in 1320 and lived through the plague of 1384. He taught at Oxford. He believed the Bible should be vernacular, and that was a thing that happened with Luther and a bunch of other people. And believed that we believe he translated the Gospels into French and into German before he died, and his followers actually translated the Old Testament way before Luther even did it. So it was something else. Now the thing is he died a very peaceful death and was buried, and 31 years after his death, the Council of Constance was formed, declared him a heretic. The Pope had him dug up, defrocked, and burned at the stake, and his ashes thrown in the river Swift, 31 years after he died. Yeah, I mean, you know. So then Jan Hus, he was born in 1369, died in 1415. He was a Czech priest, that's the one to the right on top. And he argued against the beautification of church buildings. He argued against transubstantiation and other doctrines of the church. And he was burned at the stake as being a heretic in 1415. Down to the left, we have John Calvin, who is the what everybody claims the founder of Presbyterian Church under Calvinism, along with John Knox, the one next to him. But John Calvin was born in 1509, died in 1564. He spent the end of his life in Geneva. But he was actually thrown out of Geneva at the beginning of his ministry when he went there because the city council did not like him, and they threw him out. And then they invited him back, and he led the church until he died. And of course his theology is prevalent in the Reformed Church, the Congregational Church, and the Presbyterian Church. John Knox was known as the Scottish Presbyterian, and he's the one that the Presbyterian Church USA, believe it or not, a lot of their theology comes from him. But he was kind of involved in a roundabout way in the murder of Cardinal Beaton in 1546. He was caught, John Knox was, by French forces in 1549, and he was exiled to England, and he was exiled to England and then given license in the Church of England and became Edward VI's personal chaplain, and had a lot to do with the writing of and the reform of the Book of Common Prayer in England until his death of that time when he died. The last one, John Wesley, we know John because of Methodism, but his brother Charles was also involved in the Reformation too. But he was either born June the 17th or 28th, they're not sure, of 1703. And what gets me is that John Wesley's followers were known as Methodists, but they saw themselves as Anglican. And they saw themselves as being a sect within the Anglican Church, just like the Franciscans and the Carmelites, all that. They had a rule of order that they were following, but they were still attending the Anglican Church. For some reason, the Anglican Church didn't think they were part of the Anglican Church, and they refused to give them communion. And that's when they broke off and started forming the Methodists. But the Methodists are Anglican in their beliefs, in their way of how they appoint ministers to the church. They have bishops, consuls, things like that. So they have kept their heritage.
Didn't John Wesley go back to be?
Well, you know, there's this.
Or was it he just never did say he took all the names?
I don't think he did. You know, there was a thing that Martin Luther recanted at his deathbed and became Roman Catholic and all that. There was always those stories, but we never found any proof of that either way. So these people actually, and there was a lot more that was involved in the Reformation movement as it went forward. But, yes.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Which one?
Can we assume John was a popular name back then?
Yeah, I know. Even Jan translates into John.
And Ethiopian, Czechoslovakian is a Slovakian language.
Yeah. I was thinking that too, Bill.
In Belarus, and right today, that Jan is translated into John.
Yes, and it's quite interesting. I was thinking
just
the
have to
same
bring
thing.
that up.
I was thinking the same thing.
But I think there are a lot of Johns there.
Yes.
What is
Transubstantiation. It is the belief that the Roman Catholic Church holds that the bread, even though it takes the form of bread, totally becomes the body of Christ. The wine, even though it remains the form of wine, totally becomes the blood of Christ.
Okay, all right.
Okay? We believe in consubstantiation, which means the bread is still bread, the wine is still wine. No, it's not a symbol. But Christ is permanent throughout the bread, over, under, through, on both.
And that's con.
Yes, that's consubstantiation.
And theirs was trans.
Now with the Lutheranism, they believe after the service the bread becomes bread again, the wine becomes wine again, and they used to send the bread home with the minister, okay, that the God had just kind of went back up into heaven. We don't hold that belief, neither does the Anglican Church. We keep reserved not to adore or to, but for sick and things like that, we have that right to take that to the sick. Henry VIII, everybody thinks Henry VIII began the Church of England, and in a way they were right, but Henry VIII remained Catholic to the day he died. And he never, and this is the thing that gets you, because people say, well, he divorced Catherine of Aragon. He did not divorce, he wanted annulment. They annulled. Clement refused to recognize the annulment. And that's when the break came. Okay? And he said, okay, if you don't do this, then I'll say, this is the supremacy of the King of England and not of the church. And it's not for my own church, but I have rule over the bishops and that here. And so the annulment came through. We know the rest. He married Catherine, or Anne Boleyn, who gave birth to Elizabeth, who he had executed. And Elizabeth was kind of disemboweled from the, called a bastard child and not in line. And then he married Jane Seymour. And truly, as a historian looking at Jane Seymour, I think he truly loved Jane Seymour, And Jane Seymour is the one who gave him her son and died because of that child in childbirth. Go ahead. So when we look at those things and see what happens, and then she really is Jane Seymour is the one who brought Mary, who was Catherine's daughter, back into the good favors of Henry, and Elizabeth back into the good favor of Henry, which put them back into the line of succession. Okay? So, and then he had his little, after Jane Seymour, he went off on the wild side, and he had his other wife, who we found out was having an affair. As a historian, I know, Scott, just shut up and go on, right? That's what you're
That's
anyway,
interesting.
so,
We'd like to hear that.
well, yeah.
He cuts her head off.
So Henry broke with the church in 1534, but when Henry died, he was still putting anyone to death who did not follow the Catholic teaching. He was very Catholic, and he would burn people at a stake if they were Lutheran. He hated Lutheranism, even though one of his archbishops, believe it or not, was from the Lutheran background and snuck his wife into England in a box. So no one knew he was married. So he went on. Huh?
What'd you say?
He snuck it. The archbishop snuck his wife into England, so no one knew he was married. Yeah. So anyway, he had an interesting history, and but he remained Catholic. And it wasn't until Edward VI took the throne, that's when we start seeing the development of the Book of Common Prayer. And we go on in history, which we will talk about the Book of Common Prayer in a minute. Edward VI took the throne, and then he died, and Mary came in to play. And Mary was Catherine's daughter, very Catholic, and held the title as Bloody Mary, because she started killing Protestants.
That's where Bloody Mary comes in.
Yes,
I didn't know that.
yes, yes. If you were, hey, how are you? If you were Protestant, no, doesn't matter. If you didn't recant to the church, no. You were burned at the stake, drawn and quartered, whatever. She married someone who, and they were supposedly were going to have a baby. She was pregnant. Pregnancy turned out to be a tumor, and her and Elizabeth were very close because they were exiled and they grew up together. And her court wanted Elizabeth dead, wanted Mary to sign a death warrant on Elizabeth, and she said, "No, she's my sister. I will not kill her." And when Mary tried to make Elizabeth swear that England would stay Roman Catholic, Elizabeth said, "I will not swear to that, but I will promise you that religion will be open and free." She meant that. So when Mary died, Elizabeth took the throne. She would have held to that promise, except the Jesuits come into play. Okay? The Jesuits wanted her dead. The Pope wanted her dead. As a matter of fact, she was named the bastard child of England and a heretic, and they wanted her dead. That's when Elizabeth kind of said, "This is enough," and she started rounding people up that was against her and started killing. Or I believe that the Roman Catholic Church would probably survive within England along with the Church of England. So we have that. Then we see the progression of the monarchies and how that goes. And that's in about 1778 is where, 1789 is where our church comes in. And we'll deal with that next week. The Book of Common Prayer is kind of interesting in the English church, though, due to the fact that they've only had actually, if you count the third one, it's actually the same one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 versions of the Book of Common Prayer, and the Book of Common Prayer is that's recognized, the only one recognized by the Church of England is the Book of Common Prayer of 1662. They still use that book. They use supplements to go with it, but they still use that book because Parliament cannot come up and agree with changing the Book of Common Prayer. The first prayer book, which we know as the Book of Common Prayer, was published in 1549 during the reign of Edward VI. And remember, Henry stood firm in his Catholic teachings to the end. So it wasn't until Edward took the throne and he was the child of Jane Seymour. James Seymour was for the Reformation, and he started moving the English church into that direction. And then he took on Thomas Cranmer, who revised the Book of Common Prayer in 1552 and added what was called the Black Rubric, because there was this thing about that the Roman Catholic Church, when you went up and received communion, you were kneeling to honor the presence of Christ in the sacrament, fully body and blood, and that was a Roman Catholic thing, and there was argument over whether that should happen within the English Church. So he had to put in there, we are not kneeling to honor the full presence of the transubstantiation, but we're kneeling to honor God. And it's okay to kneel to take communion. That was called the Black Rubric, and it's still in the book today. So, Thomas Cranmer revised the Book of Common Prayer in 1552 with that addition. And then when Elizabeth took the throne, and by the way, Mary had him burned at the stake very quickly, okay, as a heretic.
So
and
brutal.
Huh?
They were so brutal.
You know, some people say, you know, Mary was brutal, but Elizabeth was just as brutal as Mary. But in a way, I can see Elizabeth's point, okay? But when Elizabeth took the throne in 1552, the Book of Common Prayer was introduced, and the 1552 prayer book was reintroduced in 1559 with a couple changes, not many. And then in 1604, when James I took the throne after Elizabeth's death, he ordered changes made, which included the Catechism on the Sacraments. And then in 1662, the Book of Common Prayer is officially the Book of Common Prayer of England with the supplements, because the Parliament cannot agree on the changes on the book. As we move forward, progress in 500 years, we have the Oxford movement. And the Oxford movement was kind of like this movement that said, maybe we threw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, because what they did is when they went into Reformation, they stripped everything that was Roman Catholic. They stripped away the candles, a lot of the churches did. They stripped away the statues. They stripped away the vestments. They did away with the sanctus bells, away with the incense, everything, anything that was, and just had a baptismal fount and a table for communion. That was it in the church. And the Oxford movement said, maybe we did something bad here. You know, not everything that was Catholic was bad. As long as we don't see this as being really relative to our salvation, but just a nice way of doing things. So they started introducing back the incense, which I know why we hid the incense over here. We had to change the carpet. And they introduced the sanctus bells. They started moving in that way. As long as people knew that what was happening in tradition was not relative to their salvation, but was just a nice way, a formal way of doing things. So the Oxford movement took off, and that happened about 1831. It started and progressed into the 19th century, into there. And St. Trinity Church in Port Smith came out of the Oxford movement. When I was there for our conference, they took me through their stained glasses, the Blessed Mother and all that, and that came out of the Oxford movement. And I think the Oxford movement's a good thing. Yeah.
Going back just for a second, all right, last 1862, has the Book of Common Prayer been revised since?
No.
Oh.
No. Just supplements. They added supplements and supplements. And it was George Fraser that went to England and said, if you walk into an English church and go to a Catholic church, you could not, a Roman Catholic church, you could not tell the difference. They were the same.
True, you can.
Yeah, they were the same. But no, they were never revised. It's still in the process.
Which one, is that the one we're using?
No,
No.
we're using, we're not dealing with the American Episcopal Church until next week.
Oh, okay.
Okay? By the way, detention afterwards, you guys are late.
I know.
Okay?
When did
So,
that start?
no,
Like,
what?
Go get some soup.
What, the American Episcopal
Yeah.
Church, 1789.
1789.
Yeah. So,
I know it was 17, I just trying to get
so we
that.
moved into the Oxford movement, and things came back, and then we had what was called High Church, known as Anglo-Catholic. Okay? And then the English Church has High Church, Anglo-Catholic. They have the Broad Church, which is a High Church and Low Church put together. Could go either way. Then you have the Low Church. And the Low Church is they deal with more the evangelical than they do with the traditional. And Bishop Jake said, I'm more of a low church guy. And you could see, by the way, if you look at the progression of our bishops, you can see he's kind of that low church, but he likes the incense and that once in a while. But anyway, Rome started coming back into play, but Roman Catholics were not allowed to openly worship in England until the Catholic Relief Act of 1829. That's when they were given permission to reopen the church in England. And Elizabeth Parker, who was there, Liz Parker, I learned a lot from her about that situation. And I don't know if any of you are a BBC fan, watched Doc Martin or anything like that. But with Doc Martin, it was quite interesting. If it wasn't for Liz, I would not caught the slap in the face in Doc Martin that he gave to someone. In the English church, in the English realm of things, there's two churches, and that is the English church, the Anglican church, and the Roman Catholic church. That is the only two churches recognized in England. All others are called chapels. So if you're a Methodist, you go to chapel. If you're a Presbyterian, you go to chapel. Only two recognized churches. So Dr. Martin says to this one girl, he says, don't you have to go to chapel tonight? And it was a slap in the face to her because he was being derogatory. So just a little piece of information. But Rome also in Vatican II declared the Anglican succession of bishops legit, valid, and so they started moving towards a unity. And then the Rome started accepting priests from the Anglican faith into the Roman Catholic faith, and the Queen of England, of course, came back and said, if any of you want to come over to our side, you're more than welcome to do that. So anyway, so that's what started happening. But women in clergy did not start in the Anglican Church till 1986.
Oh.
Yes, we were the forerunners. We had women clergy in 1977. We had women priests. They did not have women priests until 1986. And they are just affirming women bishops this year in 2013. So, and we had our first women bishop in 1986, I believe. Is Bishop Harris. Yeah. Bishop.
Now you talking about women
Yes.
in the clergy in
Yes.
England, because over in Africa they had women.
Yeah.
They had women priests in Africa.
Yes, and women priests in Africa were Episcopalian, not Anglican, not English. And the Vicar of Dibley, have you found of the Vicar of Dibley? It deals with one of the first women vicars in England. It's a comedy, French. Geraldine Granger, Darlene French, plays Geraldine Granger. It's really a great thing. Watch it. It's just something else. But it deals with the attitude of what they thought about women priests at that time.
What was the name of it?
Vicar of Dibley.
Dibley.
Yes.
So that's the Anglicans in Europe.
Yes.
And then Episcopal here.
Yes. Episcopal here, we're going to discuss next week, but we had women priests, and we had women priests as early as 1977. Okay, so, but the Anglican Church just started. They had women priests in 1994, Anglican priest, and then on from there.
And that's when you have to start breaking down the Episcopal Church.
Yes.
Episcopal Church USA, Episcopal Church Canada,
Yes.
Episcopal Church wherever. You know, because we weren't all following the same way.
Right, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Next week, I know.
Well, no, we're actually going to talk about that in a minute here, a little bit.
Sam, when you
Yes.
talk about the Anglican Church, that's the Catholic Church?
Well, that's the English, we're all Anglican,
Church.
but the Church of England is Anglican. The Episcopal Church actually comes out of the Anglican Church. So yeah, we're not, and Methodists are Anglican. We were just talking about that. So, but the women were appointed as deaconesses as early as 1861 in the Anglican Church, in the English Church, but they were not ordained. And they were allowed during World War I, they were known as lay readers, but they were, after World War I, there was never a lay reader authorized until 1969 as a woman. I mean, just something else.
Let me ask you one more thing? The Anglican Church was in England,
Yes.
but here in the United States, we were Anglicans until after we got our independence. Is that about right? Is that about when they started?
You're right. We are still Anglican. As John Kirk will tell you, we are Anglican, okay? But we are the American Episcopal Church. It's a different
branch of the Anglican.
Yes. We came out of the Anglican Church, and we're going to deal with
And that's
Well,
what
the
we
first
talked about.
bishop was from, consecrated in Scotland.
Scotland.
Right.
From
And
the
that's why we have our,
And that's what I'm saying, the Episcopal Church in Canada is just like we are.
Yeah, same thing. Just-
They're Anglican too,
yes,
but they have their own Episcopal
yes.
thing, just like we do
Right.
down here.
Yeah.
In their book of Common Prayer,
is the old.
right, their Book of Common Prayer in Canada is different from ours.
Yes.
Right.
There is so many, one thing with me traveling, the one thing I always like, if I'm there on Sunday, I get to visit a different Episcopal church. In Baltimore, I visit Old St. Paul's Church. No kneelers. You do not kneel to take communion there. You take communion in a line, just like you would in the Roman Catholic Church. And they use leavened bread for the communion, not unleavened bread. Trinity in Baton Rouge is different. I mean, it's, because they have things going. There's differences with wherever you go. There's going to be differences. So, the women clergy was something else. And then, when we look at the Anglican Communion, that's where Anglicanism, the worldwide, comes in, because we are all loosely tied together, but we're separate. We have separate spiritual heads. The English Church has the Archbishop of Canterbury. There's actually two major archbishops, Archbishop of Canterbury and one of York, but the one of York is subjected to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then we have our presiding bishop, not our archbishop, presiding bishop, Catherine is our presiding bishop, which was the first woman presiding bishop ever. And she just spoke at, I forgot what college that she spoke at, which was a big thing for her to do. They never had a woman give a presentation speaking. Yeah, I forgot.
Doesn't she have 1 year left, I think?
Yeah, she will be, and the
year.
reason why, because Margaret brought up the point, she's presiding bishop until she retires. 9 years is their thing, but if she goes for re-election next time, she will be retired before the next one, so that's why she's stepping down. And we will have a new presiding bishop as of 2015, which the general conference is in Utah City. That should be interesting. A bunch of Episcopalians in Utah. Yes. So, anyway, but so we are kind of, we have those separate bodies. There's a movement that's trying to put us all under one, all under the Archbishop of Canterbury. There are some people who want that. There's other people who do not. I'm one of those that do not. I think that the way it is the way it is, and it's good. Why change it? And, it would be like being under Rome. No offense, Olivia, but, that's it. So, that is it for tonight.